Hi, I'm Dr. D. Leitner, and welcome to the Doctor's Den, where I interview friends and former students to hear their stories, learn from their personal and professional growth, and hear about how they are engaging politics, strategy, and leadership in their everyday lives. So join us as we deep dive into the lives of everyday people and try to learn some important lessons along the way. Welcome to the Doctor's Den. Hey guys, thank you so much for listening. I would love it if you could subscribe and share and let the world know about this podcast. That would be great. Thank you so much. Hey, welcome back to the Doctor's Den. Thank you so much to Aaron Kalman for being here. Aaron is the Chief of Staff at Lightricks and formerly a lot of other things. He was born and raised in Jerusalem, and he and his wife Shachar are raising their 3 kids in the same city. Aaron, thank you so much for making time for me.
Thanks for having me and inviting me.
Such a pleasure. Okay, so you and I met through an organization called the Peoplehood Coalition. And at the very beginning, I didn't really know a lot about what you had done before that. And I only found out later on as we started to get to know each other that you've done a lot of stuff in a lot of different fields. Can you give us a little bit of background about yourself just so that we can give people a feel of who you are and where you come from, what's going on?
Sure. So I'll try to sort of share my professional life story in a couple of minutes. And there's always the question if to start where I am and work backwards or start where I was and work to today. I think I'll go with the latter this time. Just makes it a bit easier to follow chronologically. So when
Okay.
I finished high school, instead I went to the Army. When I finished the Army, I did my bachelor's degree in education. I went to that program, not quite sure that's what I wanted to do in life, but understanding that I wanted to have a bachelor's degree as quickly as possible because I definitely wanted the master's degree. So one of the deciding factors was that. And then after doing that, I joined, or while I was still studying, actually, I joined the Times of Israel, which was then a young startup. Now it's a big sort of news publication that a lot of people know, but I was basically in the first 5 employees. No one really knew what was going on. There was this whole thing of building a new website. Great adventure. Got to learn a lot from David Horowitz, the founder and editor-in-chief there. And then after a couple of years there, I moved with my wife, Shachar, to Australia, where we worked on behalf of the Jewish Agency for just over 2 years as emissaries, shlichim in Sydney. Once I finished in Sydney, we came back, and then, like happens to a lot of people who relocate for work for whatever reason and come home, you send your CVs to all your friends and say, please help me find a job because I don't know what I'm supposed to do with my life now. So we came back, I sent my CV out, I found a job, but a few months after starting that job, I got a telephone from a friend who got the CV way back when and said, actually, Aaron, listen, I know you have something, but there's a very interesting senior politician who is looking for someone on his staff, and I think you'd be the perfect fit. Are you interested? I didn't know the person's name. I then said to my friend, I said, listen, you have the CV. Let him see it. If he's an interesting politician who'd like to meet me, I'll meet the person. A few weeks later, I was interviewing with Naftali Bennett, who was then the Minister of Education in Israel and Diaspora Affairs, later went on to become the Prime Minister. And within a short period of time, I had joined the staff leading the portfolio work for the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs. Just a reminder, I'd just come back from working for the Jewish Agency in Australia, so it was a very sort of natural fit. And I found myself there for a bit under 3 years. And then, like with what a lot of people probably heard with Israel, we went into election turmoils. And so I left that world right before everything sort of broke down, and I joined the Ruderman Family Foundation, a Boston-based philanthropy who deal with all sorts of things, namely inclusion of people with disabilities and Israel's relationship with the American Jewish community. So again, continuing sort of that journey, I was working on the side of American Jewish community, running their programs here in Israel, doing a lot of work for them. After a couple of years there, there was a new government, which I thought was going to be stable. I got a phone call saying, come back to do government world. Now, for anyone who's ever been in the public sector, you know that there's sort of a bug. Once you get into that world, it gets under your skin. It's hard to get out. And at the end of the day, you can also make a huge impact if you're doing things at the right time in the right place. So I said yes, and I went back to work for Orit Farkas-Cohen, who was nominated as the Minister of Strategic Affairs. After a couple of months, there was an internal cabinet shuffle, and we moved together to the Ministry of Tourism. So I was then advising the Minister of Tourism at a time where there was no tourism because it was the COVID crisis. So that was an interesting sort of experience, seeing what we could do to help people's livelihood, to maintain what we could in the business. And then I got to where I am now, which is at Lightricks, chief of staff to CEO, moved over from public to completely private sector, no regulation, no government, nothing on the sort. So big couple of transitions. Somewhere along that journey, I did my MA at the same time in parallel to work. So I did my master's is in diplomacy and strategy from Tel Aviv University. And like you said before, the most important thing is that I have 3 children. They're gorgeous. They take up most of my time, and that's who I am.
That's wonderful. Okay, thank you so much. So, I kind of want to start actually at the end. As like you went one way, I'm gonna go the other way. When you say chief of staff, I don't think a lot of people know what a chief of staff in a high tech company does. So, could you give us sort of a breakdown of what that position means?
I can give you a breakdown of what it means for me, and I can try and say what it means for some other people. But one thing which I'm going to say in advance is that I'm part of a forum of chiefs of staff here in Israel. There are people from technology companies, from business companies, from government, from all sorts of places where we try to learn from each other's experiences and know-how. And the one thing that's clear is that besides the title, there's not something that you can say is true for everyone. And the reason being, simply, I may be exaggerating a little bit, but the reason is simple. At the end of the day, the chief of staff is an extension to the CEO or a different C-level. And what you're trying to do is improve that person's work, that person's productivity. In my case, to the CEO. And so it manifests itself in many, many different ways. And I like to use 2 different metaphors, in a sense, to explain what I do. One is to be flight control. Okay, there are a lot of things happening in the air in the company. There's a lot of inbound traffic coming towards management in general, the CEO specifically. And my job is to say, okay, this is something that I need to direct home. It's time for the CEO to meet this. It's time for him to deal with it. Or something that I see coming in and say, wait a second, it's actually not ready for the management to deal just yet. It hasn't been discussed at the right levels yet. The action plan is too immature. Let's turn it around, go back, do your homework, come back, and let's not waste people's time. So that's sort of one thing, is seeing what the prioritization of day-to-day tasks or strategic tasks is, because I understand that time is the biggest resource for any manager at this level.
Okay, so for that one, do you sort of find yourself acting as like the buffer between like the operative level management, like the senior management who's got all these projects that they have to work and like they want to bring things to the attention of, and what you're saying is it's really about creating a buffer between that level and the strategic level where it's like, hey, wait a second, this doesn't need to come to us yet.
No, so I wouldn't say I'm a buffer between those levels. I work for the CEO, but I try to help all the C levels and all the management as a whole to sort of prioritize. It's yes, there's a sense of being sort of the gatekeeper for the calendar and the time and things like that. In that sense, there's maybe buffer is a good word. It's not necessarily my word of choice, but it's not a bad way to describe it. Yeah, but I think more than being a buffer, it's being, like I said, sort of that traffic director. It's not saying no, there's no one who can come in. It's saying, wait, now's the right time to come in, or this needs to wait another day. It's, I try not to say no to anyone, and at the end of the day, definitely at Lightricks, there's very much an ethos of availability and accessibility amongst senior managers to every single employee in the company, something that is very much in the DNA.
That's phenomenal.
Just as an example, the CEO has in his calendar, he has open door slots where any employee from any site in the world can schedule one-on-one time with the CEO. And all the employees know that it's there because it started as a small startup with 5 friends. It grew to what it is now, which is a much larger company. But that ethos of being accessible and being available to anyone is very much in the DNA. So in that sense, I'm not there to say no to anyone. But yes, I might say, guys, wait a second. This is a really busy week. Let's do that next week, right? So that's sort of where that meets me.
Okay, so that's part one, is sort of being that traffic control and deciding, not deciding, but sort of helping guide. I think perhaps guide is probably the best word there. You're guiding this process of how much information the CEO has to deal with at any given point in time, so that decision making can be at its best.
Right. So it's a CEO, like I said, it's the whole management. So it's, there's a weekly management meeting. That means there's an agenda that needs to be built. It means there's follow-up items to that agenda. It's really working to make that all happen. And of course, then you work not just with the management, with other functions in the company as well. If there's a decision that's made in the management, then it means that different members of the management need to prioritize their time accordingly. It means that their executive assistants need to be informed of what's important on their calendar for the next week or the next month or whatever the time limit is. It can also be, and like I said, there's sort of another metaphor which I like to use, which is if you imagine the entire organization is a big machine, there are a lot of moving parts. There's cogs and there's levers and there's bolts and there's a lot of sort of turning wheels. And someone needs to be the oil that makes sure nothing, squeaks too much. And in that sense, there's a lot of work that's done behind the scenes. There's a lot of, trying to just be in as many conversations and meetings as possible, try and sense where potential friction could happen or where problems could emerge, and then see how you resolve them before they become a problem. And what's, I think, the most interesting thing for a chief of staff, and I think that other people I speak to also have the sentiment, is that you can't really, it's a very individual job, but you can't do it if you're not working with a lot of other people. So it's a sort of contradiction between being the chief of staff and there's this title, everyone looks to you in one sense to do certain things, but in actuality, what you need to do is have a lot of trust and a lot of good relationships with a lot of other people in the organization in order to make anything happen.
Because you're not on a team, you're not on a specific team. You essentially need to have your finger in a lot of different teams and be able to smoothly work with them and also help them work with each other if something's come up, right?
Yes.
You sort of...
Yeah, exactly. And just to complicate it even more, every one of those people I work with is much more professional in his or her role than I will ever be in their role. So you could be working with people in marketing who are obviously much better marketeers than you, or people who are product who are much better product people. Not to say anything about the technical engineers, the coders, people doing computer software, which I can't do. No, I can't do it. And
100%. No, I get it. I understand it completely.
And I still need to be able to sort of identify what I spoke about, see how I can help them improve their processes while understanding that they're the experts, not me. So It's this very sort of delicate balance between being in that position, which has significant pull on the one hand, on the other hand, being almost an outsider organizational kind of structural advisor. There's this very weird dynamic going on there.
That's very cool. Okay, so I'm curious if you feel like some of the work you did in the Ministry of Tourism and Ministry of Strategic Affairs, and also before that with the Ministry of Education, how did those sort of prepare you for this job? I'm curious.
So I'd answer it at two different levels. One, I think in the practice of the level, even though the title is different, it's very similar. When you look at the structure of a minister's, sort of the way his office or her office is filled, there's a chief of staff and there are advisors. So there I was as an advisor, a senior advisor, but I wasn't the chief of staff function. But I worked very closely with the chief of staff. I saw how things are done. And had I not made the shift to private, that could have also been the next step within government for me. And I think at sort of the more profound level, it doesn't matter what the title is for a second, both of them are the same essence, which is you're working as the right hand or the extension of a senior decision-making figure in a big organization, and you want to see how those people improve and optimize their day-to-day work and how you help them make sure decisions are implemented in the organization. Now, obviously, how you do that changes dramatically. It changes between business and government. It also changes within government. If we mention two ministries, the Ministry of Education is thousands of employees. The Ministry of Tourism is hundreds of employees. That has a different dynamic with how you need to see things trickle down within an organization. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter in all those positions, and to an extent also when I was at Ruderman and in philanthropy, you're working with someone who makes a decision. You want to see that happen in reality, and there's different ways of making that happen, whether it's with internally, whether it's with external partners, whether it's just making sure that action items are followed through on. So those sort of things happen in a lot of different shapes.
Okay, so it sounds to me like the position of chief of staff, or even the advisory positions that you had in the ministries, was very much one of almost being continuing that work of being an agent or a Shaliach. You're working in agency for the CEO. You're working in agency for the minister, outwardly and also inwardly. Would that be a way you might describe it, like shlichut in a different way?
Possibly, I think in that sense, the term agency is a good term, in the sense that it's, your success as an advisor, as a chief of staff, completely depends on the trust you have from your manager. If that person doesn't view you as someone who's helping them and giving them value, there's no real way to continue the role effectively. And yes, I think that in a way you are the agency. I think that in government it's even more outright than it is in the business sector where I am at Lightricks. But it's an interesting sort of analogy I need to think about a little bit more because I hadn't really thought of it in those terms yet.
I want to just deep dive with you for a minute into what it was like to work in the ministries, because you were part of the Ministry of Strategic Affairs. I'm curious what you learned about strategy in that job.
So that was a very short experience, I'll be honest, and say we were there for only a couple of months before the cabinet reshuffle. And also, there was a decision that was made to shut down the ministry afterwards. So I learned some very interesting things there about big picture learning, looking, but and definitely working with some of the people. So it was my first time working with Olet, the minister, in a close capacity, and she's a very strategic thinking person. The director general of the ministry at the time was Ronen Manelis, who's also a very strategic looking person. So a lot of interesting lessons. It wasn't a very long experience, and in that sense, I think there's also only so much I can say I took directly from being there.
Okay. But it's stuff that you probably also applied when you were in the Ministry of Tourism afterwards, correct? Like, you were still working with her, and if she has that strategic thinking, so I'm curious if you learned anything. How did you learn, or what did you learn about strategy from her and from that experience in those two ministries then?
All right, so that's a good question. I think that identifying what the strategic problem is or what the strategic topic is, as opposed to what the tactical thing is something that was made very, it's one of those lessons that I definitely took from there. So if we speak really about the transition for tourism for a second, I mentioned you were in tourism during COVID. Now, on a regular sort of course of business, if you're looking now at the Ministry of Tourism, they have a very clear goal by the government. It's an economic ministry. Their goals are to increase the number of tourists coming into Israel in order to increase the spend of foreign currency within Israel, which obviously helps a lot of businesses, from hotels and flight operators until merchants inside the markets at the Old City in Jerusalem or in Akko or in Jaffa, or drivers of shuttles and even catering services who cater to group. And this whole trickle effect of the economy and how things work. Now, usually you're dealing with that strategy, but at a tactical level, because you're saying, okay, how can I increase it another 5%? How can I bring a new, flight, a new carrier, a new airline to bring people from direct flights, let's say from India, which is a huge market, or from China, which is a huge market? Because if you do that, then you're going to continue doing what your strategic goal is at a better case. And then you arrive, it's tourism, but it's COVID, and there are no tourists. And now you have to sort of rethink the entire concept. What is the Ministry of Tourism's role when there are no tourists? How do you sustain tens of thousands of families whose livelihood is dependent on inbound tourism when that's not happening, right? And so being able to sort of flip the question and see what do you do, how, for instance, just as an example, how do you increase domestic tourism? How do you start encouraging Israelis, even during a time of pandemic, to, yes, it's time to go and take a family vacation, a weekend away inside Israel, things like that, which aren't the classic sort of area in which the ministry operates, but you do that because you understand that if that doesn't happen, then tens of thousands of families are going to lose their livelihood and not have their job right now. So there's all sorts of bigger questions that start emerging.
So it's almost like the ideal type, especially because you were doing this during COVID. It was like ideal type of what strategy would look like. Hey, it's all about bringing in external tourists to bring money into the country, etc. It was like, no, we have to flip the script on that ideal type and say, how do we maximize tourism inside our country so that we can at least keep things moving on some level smoothly? And there's
different sort of definitions of strategy, right? And so One of them is, there's two that I like using, and I think both fit here nicely. One is it's the art of always questioning your basic assumptions, right? Like, what am I doing and why am I doing it? Not just the what, but the why. Are you doing it? And the second one is that it's an art of allocating scarce resources. And I think that in that sense, when you have such a shattering thing like COVID, which obviously affected a lot of people all over the world, not only Israel's tourism sector, it sort of forces you to start questioning both, because all your assumptions all of a sudden are blown out the door, and you have to start really figuring out the big questions and how life looks now under this case of COVID. And it's funny that we're talking about COVID. I don't know if you saw, just sort of side note, last week, the World Health Organization issued an official release saying COVID is no longer a global health risk.
Wonderful.
So just sort of, just as a sort of closure to that. But going back to strategy, so really these assumptions are, all up in the air. And then you see, okay, how do I allocate what resources I have, which obviously are going to be more scarce than before, because if you look at a government budget, at a time of pandemic, you're going to be, allocating and dedicating resources to health, to, personal safety, to things like that. You're not going to be putting them in necessarily in building tourism and infrastructure when there's no inbound tourism, right? So it's this sort of active balancing. On the other hand, you also understand tourism is going to come back in 1 and 2 and 5 years, and you can't not invest now, because if you want to be ready for when it comes back, you have to have done something in the meantime. So it's this really delicate act constantly of balancing the two.
I think that's really neat. I think it's because you talk about it in terms of resources. I generally look at resources at the operative level. I mean, yes, it's a strategic thinking, but operative level thinking is about what resources do I have available, and what's the doctrine that's balancing. Like, what are my values, and what are the things that are I'm either going to allow me or not allow me to use those resources over time. By bringing it up a level and saying, hey, resources, yes, but it's also about really getting to those base assumptions, those root causes of why things happen, and really looking at what we know and why we know it, and then having that sort of trickle down into how we distribute those resources. It's sort of almost the combination of the two. It's not this or this, right?
It's never black and white, right?
Right. It's not. It's like but it's not even that it's black and white. It's almost like it's not even gray. It's almost like it's this and this together is a very functional way of looking at strategy. It's look at root causes, try and understand where are we at making assumptions, what's our knowledge base, what's the functional reason for this, and what do we think in terms of future thinking as a result, because it's ideal type future thinking. And then, okay, well, what kind of resources do we need, and how are we going to distribute those to different groups to be able to do what we want done now and in the future?
And then the question, which of course underlies all of that, it might tie together, is the why. Why are we doing all of this? Why are we making these decisions in this order? Why are we allocating those resources, et cetera, et cetera?
And that's functionally root causes. Like, it's why. Like, there's a concept called the 5 whys, right? It's you ask why 5 times just to get to a root cause. You might not even get to 5, but like by asking it 5 times, you really are getting into why. Why are we doing this? What's purpose? And that's what root causes are, or purpose statements.
Yeah, so that's interesting, because there's also, I just heard a lecture a couple of weeks ago, and they spoke about the opposite when you're coming down into planning. So one of the things I do in my current role is I oversee the planning process in the company. And then so one of the questions that you're told to keep asking is, and then what? Right. So you're doing something, and then what? And then
I use what ifs.
Right, what ifs, exactly. And then it sort of helps you drill, not from the strategic, but to the really tactical level of what you're measuring and what the next parameter, the next KPI is.
Right.
Okay, and then what? And then what? So here it's reverse engineering that. So why? And it's really the two sides of the spectrum.
Yeah. It's actually it's almost like a bridge between the two. You've got, actually, if we were going to really think about it, it's why leads to, into what ifs, which is sort of operative level thinking, like, well, what if we were to do this, or what if we were to do that, and then okay, and then what, to really dig down into that tactical stage of, hey, this is the nature of here are our KPIs, here are OKRs, here's our strategy, our ideal type vision, here's OKRs that are going to help make that vision, and then here's our KPIs that are tactically going to be our markers for key results. You got these? Okay, great. We've met our KPIs, and then what? And now what? I love that. That's such a great way of sort of bringing those 3 ideas sort of together. It's really cool. Wow. Okay. So I kind of want to get into how you see strategy in your life now. Like, what lessons have you learned as the chief of staff about how to think about strategy, and what would, like, if somebody wanted to get into, I mean, not necessarily Lightricks, but move from public sector to private sector and stuff like that, what would you say is like a major thing that they should be sort of thinking about?
I think those are two big questions. Where do you want to start? Which one do you want to start with?
Let's start with the second one. You know what? No, yeah, let's start with the first one. So strategy. How are you seeing strategy in what you do now, and how are you implementing that?
Okay, so I think first of all, I'll be honest and say it's next month in June it'll be 2 years since my transition from government to private. I'm still in a learning curve. So obviously it might not be as steep as it was 2 years ago, but I'm still learning a lot. And I think if you sort of double click into the domain that we're working in, Lightricks, for those people who don't know, is a company based in Jerusalem, global presence, where the company behind all sorts of leading photo and video editing apps on your phone. So some of the more known names are the names like Photo, Video, and of course Facetune, which is one of our biggest brands. And so in our specific domain right now, if we're talking about strategy, and you look at 2020, 2023, we're looking at two huge shifts that are forcing everyone in this in tech in general, and in our world in specific, to sort of question all those assumptions which we were talking about before, right? So
Right.
just to sort of really spell out what I mean by that is, first of all, we see a big transition in the macroeconomic environment, and that's affecting tech markets in specific, in a very straight way. So we're still a private company, but yes, we're part of the scene and the discourse, and we have to figure out with ourselves what that means for us and how that positions us in a business perspective. And
Hmm.
the second one is the emergence of generative AI. So we saw at the end of, in the summer of 2022, almost a year ago, the emergence of things like Midjourney and Stable Diffusion and all these, text to image, as it was called, when people could type in, I want to see a purple dog chasing a frisbee on the moon, and you get this really cool image in front of you.
Mm-hmm.
And because that's the field we operate in as a company, where we have photo editing apps, we have video editing apps, and wait a second, there's this brand new technology. What does it mean for us? How do we incorporate it within our apps? What
Mm-hmm.
threats could it pose? What opportunities does it give us, et cetera, et cetera? So also here, there's a big sort of strategic questions that need to be asked, not just on a day-to-day life or level, but really, what does it mean for the company? And in that sense, I'm still, like I said before, in somewhat of a learning curve, because it's my
Mm-hmm.
first time dealing with these huge strategic business questions in this environment. And I have to say, I'm very happy to be where I am, because I have some great mentors, the founders of the company, the C-level in the company, other employees who have been here for years dealing with this space. And it's a really good opportunity for me to learn from them as well.
That's very cool. It sounds, based on how you're talking, that you used something similar to like the SWOT analysis, right? Where you look at strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats in order to sort of figure out where you are strategically and where you want to go strategically as a result of that. I tend to think of opportunities as, where can I take chances, like and what level of risk am I willing to engage in, while threats very often are, well, what do I think I'm controlling, and what do I think I know, and what do I think I can do, and then look like, well, that's what's threatening that, or what's making that going to make that not feasible anymore. Would that be an accurate way of sort of?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of describing the, like SWOT analysis. We use different models. So SWOT analysis is definitely one of them, where we look around and we see what we do know, what we don't know. There's other models which are like a three horizon model. I'm guessing right. So for those listeners who don't, so you're looking sort of near term, middle term, and long term. And in business terms, we like to say a year, 2 years, and 5 years ahead. It can also be a year, 2 years, and 10 years ahead. Each company relating to itself, and you see, okay, this is what I'm doing right now. This is what I want to do in 2 years or in 3 years, what I want to do in 5 or in 10 years, but also understanding how what I'm doing now connects to where I want to be in 10 years. Because if I'm wasting my energy now on something that's irrelevant in 10 years, okay, then is it still worth doing what I'm doing now? Or on the other hand, do I have to do what I'm doing now just to give myself enough oxygen to build something completely new down the road, right? So both of them could be an option, and that's another sort of way of looking at things.
So I'm wondering, how is generative AI impacting your ability to see that distant horizon? Because it's moving so fast. right? There's just so much going on in that domain so quickly that the idea that you can even look 5 years ahead, 7 years ahead, you can, but it's difficult. You can look a year ahead, 2 years ahead, and maybe sort of gauge, well, if this is where we are now and this is the speed we're moving, we could get to there.
First of all, you're absolutely right. I think if you look at like a tech level, understanding where we're going to be in 6 months or a year is challenging. People looking around us, and in some sense, generative AI is almost becoming the norm, right? Like people are posting songs that are, text to voice, where you're mimicking, songs by Drake or the Beatles or anyone else, and it's like this norm already on Twitter and the different places like that. These things weren't around 3 months ago, right? It's all super new, and yet it's already part of the discourse as though it's been here forever. And in that sense, yeah, it's a big challenge, and there's only so much you can predict. On the other hand, there are things that aren't only the tech aspect, there's also a business aspect. There's things like questions that you ask yourself: what space do you want to be playing in? Do you want to only be playing in photo? Do you also want to be playing in video? Do you want to do both? So we currently do both, but that's all, for instance, a question that one might ask themselves, right?
Yeah, 100%.
A year ago, just another example, Lightricks acquired a company in Chicago called Popular Pays, a company which is sort of a matchmaker, if you would. It's a platform for matching between brands who are looking for creators to create creative marketing content for them, and creators who are looking for business opportunities to monetize their creativity and following on social media. Cool. So we made that acquisition. We went into a new place that we hadn't been doing before.
The creator space, like you specifically went into the creator space.
And into the creator monetization space.
Right.
Exactly. Before that, we had creators who were creating their content in our tools, but we weren't providing the monetization. Right. And our user research team and our corporate development teams did a lot of homework and research to figure out what our users were looking for, which we weren't offering back then. And that was a decision that was made. And that's a big strategic decision. Right? We talked about allocating of resources before. So obviously, when you have an acquisition, it's every type of resource you can imagine. There's the payment involved for the actual deal. There's the attention span of, integrating a company and a company culture into an existing company. There's a lot of things going on around sort of these M&A deals, and that's a strategic decision. Now, those questions, even though we still have very much unknown territory, like you said, there's still questions that you're playing, because you're not just going to sit back and wait. And, we want to be here, and we want to be a bigger, stronger company in a year and 2 years and 5 years from today. So yes, we have to see what we can do now. And like I said before, those sort of three horizons that will help us in the long run. Even if we don't know where that will be, there are building blocks that we think we will need no matter what is happening forward.
Right. It's what do I want to be in those 5 years? It's not necessarily, I don't know what the environment's going to be like. I can't even begin to imagine what the environment's going to be like in 5 years, but I know what I want to look like 2 years from now. I know what I'd like to look like 5 years from now, in big picture, in that, based on the information we have now, based on what we understand from that information and how that creates our ideal type, this is where we want to see ourselves moving. And here are the major stepping stones, right? Those major objectives that we have to hit from here to there. And if we're not focusing on those, what's
Exactly. Yeah. And those major objectives are in a lot of different fields, but yes, that's exactly right.
Right. I think it's really neat. I know that the creator space is a huge space. It's like they're talking getting up to like $500 billion soon as like a space on its own. So that's like a huge space to be going into, and it's very interesting that you guys made that decision to make that acquisition.
So like I said, we were in the creator space before, because just again, some numbers about Lightricks. So Lightricks has over 600 million downloads of the apps around the world. We've got tens of millions of monthly active users. And even before we made that move to like creator monetization, a lot of the creators were creating their content inside our tools. So Lightricks has always been part of the creator space, and this was a decision to sort of expand what we're doing within that space.
Yeah, I guess that's what I meant, because obviously, if you're working with video and you're working in with photos, there's a high likelihood that you're in the creative space. But it's the idea that you are now putting your fingers into and sort of branching out and saying, well, you don't just have to use us for this, but we can also help you finance and monetize what it is you're doing with purpose. And that's very, very cool. Okay, so I want to transition for a minute and talk to you about what it was like to move from public sphere to private sphere.
I already mentioned learning curve, right? So it's like a big slap to the face and take it from there.
Yeah, okay. Slap, quish. Okay, so no, but there was more to it. You made a decision. Like, this was a decision, because you could have You could have tried to continue working for a member of Knesset or in a different, ministry or through an advisory position. I'm sure you could have found something, or gone into something related to other organizations like the Jewish Agency or one of the other organizations out there that do all this wonderful, wonderful work. But you chose not to. Why?
No, so it's a really good question. I think like every good question, like you said, you have to ask 5 times why when we're going backwards. So there's more than one reason to it. I'd say that, and not in necessarily in a specific order. I'm just going to sort of rattle
Yeah,
off
that's
what
fine and
comes to
dandy.
mind. Um, One is fatigue. At the end of the day, working inside government, I said before, it can be super satisfying, but it's also very intense. There's a need to be available at just about every hour of the day, every day of the week, if big things happen. And that fatigue, it was only amplified during times of uncertainty. So if we're talking, again, COVID, multiple election cycles, no state budget, a lot of sort of work and a lot of constraints that just made the work that much harder, and the sort of toll on not necessarily a mental health per se, but sort of psychological well-being toll of needing to grind that out day after day, week after week, month after month. I was looking to take a break, combined with the fact that when I made the transition, my wife was pregnant with our third child, and I also wanted to be able to have that availability for the family a little bit more and be combined with them. So those two definitely played a determining factor. I'd add to that another one, which is something everyone sort of asks themselves, I guess, at some point in life, which is salaries and conditions and things like that. And yes, I wanted to find out what it was like to work in the business. I was doing things that had a lot of added value, and I felt an immense feeling of good when I was working in those places, whether it was the Jewish Agency or the Ruderman Family Foundation or government and all these places that truly changed the world for the better. I really believe that. But knowing from, again, our personal family sort of point of view that the opportunity to advance there and, at least through like the eyes of the paycheck, right? You say in Hebrew, the chol shel hagrosh, that the hole in the token kind of thing. It's more limited. It's a different type of ascent, and I wanted to experience the business thing. And I combined that, if I go back to the fatigue, with another sort of thing which I wanted, or experience which I wanted to have in government, which was in the positions I was working in government. Whenever we went to elections, by default, I knew I was losing my job and I'd have to find a new job afterwards. I wasn't a civil servant that had tenure. It didn't matter which minister came or left. I was with the minister, and when the minister left, I left along with them. And in that sense, it was almost like being fired with complete disregard to your capabilities, your personal abilities.
Right. It had
And
nothing to do with what you could bring to the table. It had everything to do with the fact that the elections decided that you are no longer going to be working.
Exactly. And so all of those put together were sort of this thing that said, okay, you know what, now is the right chance to make that decision, which is sort of the right timing. I'll add to that a friend called Yidan, who was working at Lightricks. I'd known him for a few years, and called me basically when he heard I was thinking about this. He called me up and said, listen, Aaron, we're at 400 employees, Lightricks. We're expanding, and Ze'ev, the CEO, has decided he wants a chief of staff. This function didn't exist before in the company. This is your chance to make the transition. Come. So the combination of those, obviously it wasn't a come and the job was a guarantee. There was an interview process, there was a learning process, but
of course.
having sort of those things fit into the perfect storm were definitely a good both push and pull to where I am today.
Okay. Wow. Okay. So it sounds like you really enjoyed the work you were doing and in the public sphere, and that you really would have been happy to stay there if you didn't have to deal with those two major issues of like, I get fired, but it's not me. And also the issue of like, there's this three things, monetary thing of, well, there's no real way to advance here. There's like a limit, and it's very set in stone how much you can make doing the jobs. And also just the stress of it, like the constant, those three things put together. But it sounds like you were enjoying yourself. Like
I was. I think that the best way to maybe to explain it is, like I said, I had two sort of rounds in government. One with Naftali Bennett in the Education Diaspora Ministry, and then one with Orit Farkas Cohen, Ministry of Strategic Affairs and Tourism. And they were two very different times from a political perspective. Not Aaron, not my role specifically, just sort of what was happening around me in government. The first time around was a stable government. It lasted for just about 4 years. There was a very clear state budget. And what that meant is that we in the Ministry of Education could do what governments, in my opinion, are supposed to do, which is plan long-term strategic initiatives that impact the life of every citizen for the better, right? So if I look back at what we were doing then, just to give one example, which many Israelis know, Naftali Bennett then pushed advanced math across all of Israel, right? And if you look at those numbers from then, it's a project that took a long time to implement and took years to come to fruition. But the numbers are showing that it was right. If you look today, I just saw a report about a month ago or a few weeks ago, that the number of students, high school students graduating with advanced matriculation in math is up by tens of percentage points compared to where it was when we were working on that project in 2015, 2016, 2017, right? So being able to look back and say, wow, okay, those projects were put on the right tracks, they advanced, they got where they are, and thanks to that work, which again isn't, I had a very small role to play in there. There were other people on the team who did the burden of the thing, obviously the ministry and the professional staff who did all of that. And you say, okay, we did something. We changed children's life in the periphery, in Shlomi and Ofakim, and places like that. We gave them a chance to do things that they might not have had a chance to do otherwise. And that's a really good feeling. And with that good feeling, then you can do things that are planned for the long term. And even if it takes somewhat of a personal toll, it's okay. But then I go back the second time in government where you don't have that ability to plan far ahead because of instability. You don't have the ability to plan that far ahead because there is a lack of budget at a sort of a deep level, and you can't really guarantee resources for long-term projects. And of course, combine that with COVID and just the natural stress that everyone, and this has nothing to do with if you're in government or not government, we've all seen the numbers about mental health and personal well-being during the times of COVID, okay? In Israel, the number of calls to, mental health hotlines and personal, health hotlines increased dramatically during COVID just because of what was happening. People were under lockdown. People weren't leaving their houses. The people were just, also afraid that this was sort of the last day walking on the planet, right? And so all those things combined really, for me, put my second time in government in big, big contrast to the first time in government. And I still think till today that had it not been what it was and had it looked more like the first time, I probably would have stayed longer because those things make a big difference.
Right, that makes sense. The environment impacted your decision making because it showed you the two sides of that coin. This is what it is when things are going well, but you still have to take responsibility when things are not going well. And on governmental level, it can be an extremely stressful situation. Not that it can't in business as well. Let's be honest. When a business goes from being top in its field and all of a sudden, like, wait a second, there's some new emerging blue ocean that we didn't even realize was going to happen, and oh my gosh, and you see yourselves suddenly losing traction or whatever, there's an impact there, but you totally, like, at least there it's not impacting hundreds of thousands of millions of people who are...
No, I think you're absolutely right. Like in July, Lightricks, unfortunately, we had to lay off some people at the company. It's not a secret. We were amongst the first Israeli companies to lay off employees when the sort of macro recession started, July 22. I'm not the CEO, I'm not the CFO. Obviously, the responsibility on their shoulders is much greater than it is on mine in that sense. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if it's one person or 10 people. Each one of those people, them and their family was affected to the most, deepest and problematic way by what had to happen. And of course, like you said, it can happen tenfold. If you look at the large tech companies today, Google, Meta, Amazon, people are laying off in the tens of thousands, right? And yet, just like you mentioned, it's not quite the same feeling as saying, if I make the wrong decision, then the entire industry of tourism is going to collapse, right? Like
exactly.
It's still this balance.
It's orders of magnitude different. Like, it's in orders of magnitude. It's exponentially bigger when you're talking government.
And by the way, I have to say, I'm talking, at the end of the day, I was the advisor, I'm the chief of staff. I'm still not actually the decision-making person in the process.
Right,
and
exactly.
I can only imagine the burden that's on their shoulders, when they make these decisions. If this is what I was feeling at a personal level.
I can imagine. Like, I can imagine just how much of a burden it is. I would assume, and this is an assumption on my part, that part of your job is to sort of help them as as the chief of staff, sort of like, hey, okay, how can I help you carry this burden a little bit? Sort of not necessarily not do it for them because you can't make the decision for them. You can't do this job for them, but you can help them with it.
I think the best way to help them in that sense is to do, and this is, I think, where my role is to make sure that the decision they made is as informed as possible, that it's as optimal as possible given the circumstances, given the time, given everything around. But if I was to find out at some point that had I missed a piece of information, that had I did a different calculation, the decision could have been different, that is something that would haunt me and would, obviously haunt them. And in that sense, just making sure that decision making, that we all know we speak about strategy, decision making is only as optimal as it is at that point in time. It's always easy
as the information you have at that point.
Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly.
A given situation at a given room at a different point in time. It's always easy in hindsight to sort of say, oh, had we known this, had we done that, great. That doesn't help anyone, right? The question is, given if you were taken back to that same point in time with the same information you had then, would you have made the same decision? Usually the answer is yes, all right? And when the answer is no, that's a sort of a different question, which is, maybe you weren't 100% sure with the decision you made at the time or things of this sort.
Or it could be, it's also, one of the things that I have found is that when you get to that point where you're questioning that strategy, because to my mind, one of the ways I define strategy is the process of taking incoming information, analyzing it, and creating a knowledge tree that allows you to make good decisions. That's sort of how I see strategy. It's this process of take this, analyze it. If you could go back and say, with same information, my knowledge tree, and this is the decision I made, you can say, wait a second, then what was it? One of the biggest things I try and help people do, for instance, is say, well, what do you learn from this? How could you make better decisions next time? Was it the channels by which you got your information? Was it who did the analysis and how the analysis was undertaken? Is it how you connected those pieces into a tree for yourself? Like, what was it that caused the poor decision? And how can you make it so that next time you'll make better decisions strategically? So that sounds like kind of what you're trying to talk about now.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one sort of practical, if I was, people listening to us who are looking for a practical suggestion to how to do that, one thing which I strongly encourage people I work with, not necessarily my bosses, but just in general, people I work with, is to have someone that they really trust, who they don't mind acting as a sounding board and confident with them. And a lot of times it doesn't have to be, it's not me. And in some cases, it shouldn't even be someone in the organization. It can be someone that you completely trust outside the organization, and you say, listen, I have to make a decision. Now, obviously, maybe you can't share all the information, or you can't even share all the decisions, but someone, and if it's someone who doesn't agree with you on everything, but always has your best interest in their mind, perfect. Because you want someone to play devil's advocate, and you want someone to challenge your thought process. And if you can have that person, I can tell you, for instance, at Lightricks, there's an external advisor who the management uses, and each one of the sort of members of the management at that C-level, each one of them speaks to him, if not on a weekly, then a bi-weekly basis. To have that person who's a little bit more removed from the day-to-day life of the organization, a little bit there, but knows people well enough to give them a safe space where they can really sort of say, okay, this is something I'm grappling with. This is the question I have. How would you deal with the situation? And having that someone who you can really sound off and use as that whiteboard or that echoing board is a really important part of making a good choice.
Right. And I firmly believe in the idea of making sure it's someone who understands how to give, who engages radical candor. Radical candor is making sure that when you give me that feedback, you're going to give it in a way that I'm going to understand it. I'm going to be able to hear it. I'm going to be able to actually utilize what you're saying. And I'm not immediately going to have triggers of defensiveness or whatever, but really, how to speak to me, and how to get to the core issues and tell me where I'm messing up. What is it that I'm not seeing? What is it I'm doing wrong here that I could do better? Those two things.
Yeah, no, I agree. Radical candor is a great way of saying it. Our CTO here also likes to use the term. He wants people to be nice and not kind. And what that means is, if you have something on your teeth, just as an example, tell the person he has something on his teeth. Being kind would be sort of ignoring and not letting them be embarrassed for that second. But being nice is letting them know, hey, you have it, and then we won't have any more embarrassment down the road, right? Give that practical solution.
Right, but if you can do it in a way which sort of lets them do it with with the minimum amount of embarrassment as possible.
100%.
100%. Like
Yeah,
that's
you don't need to
really
come with like a megaphone and shout it down the
you've
auditorium,
got
right?
dirt on your
Yeah.
100. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So I want to actually. Okay. That was great. That was yeah. Um, I want to actually dive in with you on what you did at Ruderman for a minute, because I know that that's when I met you. I met you when you were at the Ruderman Foundation, and I actually find what they do to be very, very fascinating. And it's, again, they sort of fall between government and private, because they're a philanthropic organization, but they try and influence government, and they also influence, the public sector, and they also sort of kind of influence the private sector in some ways.
100%.
And I'm really curious. So for people who don't know about Ruderman, can you just give us like a brief, here's what Ruderman does, and then I'd like to dive in with you a little bit on what that meant for you.
Yeah, sure. So a very brief, this is what Ruderman does, because I haven't been there for a few years and they might also have shifted. I don't want to misrepresent what they're doing, but
Big
in a
asterisks.
nutshell,
Big
yeah,
asterisks.
big, not just a grain of salt, like just pour a kilo of salt on my head or something.
No problem.
So but in a nutshell, the Ruderman Family Foundation are as it says in the title, it's a family foundation by the Ruderman family. They're based in Boston, and historically they operate in two main fields. One is the field of disability inclusion, which means helping people with disabilities become included in every single aspect you can imagine of day-to-day life, the workforce, education, entertainment, everything. And the second one is strengthening the Israelis' relationship with the American Jewish community. Now, just sort of zooming in, I was working on the second one, on Israel's relationship with the American Jewish community, where the Ruderman Family Foundation, I have to say, you mentioned where we met at the Coalition for the People of the Coalition, has become less unique, but they're still trailblazers in that sense. Most organizations who work on this divide between the Israeli Jewish community and Jews in the diaspora in general, or in the United States at large, tend to focus on how we get diaspora Jews or Jews around the world to know Israel better, to know Israelis better. And what the Ruderman Family Foundation did a couple of decades ago already was say, wait a second, it's a two-way street. We need to work with Israelis and to have them understand and know the American Jewish community. It can't only work if we work on one side of the relationship. And that's why their programs in that field are managed in Israel and are mostly catering to Israelis. Now, if I take that sort of one sentence description I just gave about what they do, that's also very much a mindset of the Ruderman Family Foundation, which is, you said, philanthropic money can influence a lot of people. It can influence government. It can influence the private sector. It can influence just about anything you speak about. And their mindset has always been, and I admire it, to look for places where people aren't dealing, to say, okay, we have, going back to strategy, we have resources, we have, a foundation. They are limited to an extent, right? You can't go and spend everything, or if you do, then that's it, you're done. Where do we put this to maximize our effect? And they've always looked for places that are sort of untapped or original, or they believe can have a very long-term impact. And just to give two examples from the two fields. So one, which is the field I worked with, Israel relationship with the American Jewish community. There's a program, Jewish listeners to this podcast will know, Birthright, Taglit, where it has been around, for 2 decades, brings young Jews from all over the world to meet Israel, to have an experience here. Great. And then the foundation said, okay, let's also take, not at the same scale, we're not going to fly all Israeli teenagers to meet American Jews around the world, but let's take Israeli decision makers and have them meet the American Jewish communities. And they started out with journalists and with members of Knesset, Israel's parliament, to fly and sort of interact there. And that really snowballed and over time became something that's a much more common practice these days. So you have all sorts of organizations. Geshe, the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs, adopted their model and sponsors these delegations. And that's sort of a place where they identified a strategic need to build a two-way street and not just a one-way street, and said, how do we start doing that? And there are other programs of this sort. A different place, and you mentioned just how philanthropy can impact private. I think they've done a wonderful job inside Hollywood about visibility and authentic casting of people with disabilities within the entertainment sector. So one thing which is, it's interesting, wasn't what I was working on, but something that, I saw in got to sort of be part of in the second circle of the organization. Um, if you look at places like Hollywood, where people produce the biggest movies, and at the end of the day get to every household more or less in the world through this entertainment industry, then you see that a lot of people without disabilities are playing people with disabilities, and people with disabilities aren't necessarily getting the same chance to be on screen. And then the foundation asked, two simple questions, which is, one, why not cast people with disabilities for roles with disabilities? Why do we have to have someone, and David, I know you as an example, right? This isn't just because we're talking, but as an example, if you need a character who's in a wheelchair, why can't it be someone in a wheelchair playing that character, right? Why do you have to have...
If anyone ever needs a wheelchair shooter, I'm game.
Yeah,
I know.
yeah. This was just a plug-in for you.
Yeah, let's go.
This was just a plug for you to volunteer. That's all.
Of course.
And so that's sort of one question. The other one is, when you're writing a script, and I'm not even talking about main characters now. Okay, if you have a main character who's going to be there, you have specific requirements. There's also name recognition and all sorts of considerations, marketing that come there. Okay, that's sort of... Let's say you're casting a movie and there's a scene in a courtroom, and you have a lawyer who for 3 minutes is presenting a case. That's the entire thing in this 90-minute movie. There's 3 minutes with the lawyer. Is there anywhere where it says that lawyer can't be blind, or that lawyer can't be paraplegic, or that lawyer has to stand on 2 legs? Right? There's no. And so what the foundation did is they worked with partners in all sorts of fields, both in the studios, at acting schools, at all sorts of places in the United States, to really push this idea of authentic casting forward. And if you look, and again, I don't want to misquote numbers because I haven't been there for a few years, but if you look on their website, you can see the work that's done. And you can also just see how it's taken and caught along. One example for that is a few years ago at the Oscars, which is sort of the holy grail of the entertainment industry. Part of the ceremony was co-hosted by a person with Down syndrome. And right now, obviously, it's not on the screen in the sense of in the movie, but having a co-host of the Oscars, someone with disability, a visible disability, take part in that stage is a statement, and that wouldn't have been done without the Ruderman Foundation's work. So those are sort of 2 examples of what the foundation does. And I know I went a little bit longer than you had expected, but I hope that it contributed something.
No, it did. That was wonderful, actually, because it actually allows me to ask a question about what you mean by program officer. You were the program officer for programs here in Israel. How did you see yourself, and how did you engage? Because that's more an operative level thinking. It's not strategic. You're already taking strategy, and you're supposed to be implementing it. You're supposed to be taking those ideas and breaking them down. How did you, or what did you learn while you were there about that process?
So just one correction, which is there's a program officer for all the programs in the field, also the ones here and also the ones in the United States that had to do with Israel disability inclusion.
Okay, no problem.
But no, that's just a technicality. I'd say this, the organization there is much more lean than government for sure, but also than where I am right now in business. It's a very small operation. And in that sense, the other program officers, which, that's the title is program officer, in some sense it's a project manager. There's different ways of sort of looking at the role. It's a bit of everything. It's also wait a second, what program do I want to implement, which goes back to strategy and saying, okay, if this is the budget I have for the next year, this is my wish list, but I can only, put in my shopping cart so many things on this budget. So what am I going to prioritize over the other? And there's the strategic one. And then there's the sort of, from there, like you said, you start breaking it out, and then what, right? And taking it to the next level, which is if you have an idea who the right partners are, which is already borderline between strategic and tactical decision-making. It's all the way down to how I manage my budget, how I see it executed, how things happen. And I think for me, if I sort of go back to that life story, I think there was a lot in common there and with being the Shaliach, that Jewish agency emissary in Sydney. Because in Sydney, when you're working for the Jewish agency in any place in the world, you're really kind of on your own on the ground. So in Sydney, it's a big Jewish community. There are more than one Shaliach. There were 5 or 6 couples of us at the same time, but each of that still operating in your own sort of silo. And in that sense, my support system, the Jewish agency, were located primarily in Israel. Okay, it's big time difference, travel difference. They're not the people who know the community. They're not the people who know what's going on in the ground. So I have to decide what I want to do at a strategic level, and then I have to take the resources I have, prioritize them, implement it and see things happening. And I think in that sense, those two things had very similar traits to what was going on. And I'd also say that if we spoke a lot about strategy at the beginning of our talk, both those roles also help you dictate strategy, because you can understand strategy really well, but if you don't have the ability to look 3 or 4 steps ahead and say, okay, this is a great vision, but to implement it, this is what you need to do, then you can come up with great skyscrapers that stay on paper and are never built, right? And there's a commander I had in the army who once said that I can plan the best operation possible, but if no one fuels the Jeeps, we're not going to go anywhere.
Right. So that's that stage that you're talking about, that middle ground that you're talking about. It's called the operative stage or the operative level, depending on whether you're talking hierarchy or process, right? And it's not the tactic. It's not the actual maneuvers. It's not the actual getting the pieces into place. It's that stage where you look at resources and you say, okay, this is ideal type. This is what we want to do. This is how now I've been given these resources to do it with. I have to break these resources down, and I have to give them value statements. This project is more important to us, or this part of the project is essential. This is a nice to have. This is a have to have. Okay, well, that means this has to get resources. If I have resources over, then this can get, right? That process of prioritization, that's operative level thinking. It's not the grand decision of vision, but taking it and breaking it down into its parts and setting clear objectives that will allow for tactics to take place.
100%. Yeah, I think I'm talking about that, and I'd say that maybe there's like sort of another, I don't know if there's a term for it or not, but like another in between, which is I understood the vision of the foundation. If we're talking about the Ruderman Family Foundation, they wanted to connect Israelis to American Jewish community. That's the vision, right? And now within there, there's strategic work to be done about mapping out who those Israelis are, right? So are you talking about academics? Are you talking about journalists? Are you talking about politicians? You know what? Take it completely different shift. Are you talking about social activists, about school teachers, about anyone, business people? It can be a lot of different sort of things there. And there, it's still not quite operational yet. It's still a little bit at the strategy, but that strategy already influences the operational and is influenced by the operational. It's already this, sort of give and take game that you're playing.
That's the connection between them, right? It's interesting because if you think about strategy as process, I like to say that every strategic part or every part of the greater creative process we're talking about has a 3-stage process in it, where you have to sort of connect to the stage beforehand and say, okay, you've given me information. Now I need to take that information and I need to analyze it, right? Which is my own little strategy within the greater picture of strategy. I need to take it and analyze it for my work as an operative at the operative level or during the operative stage. I need to understand it. I need to create my own little knowledge tree about that, right? This is my branch that I have to have different little branches on and leaves on and whatever, and then take that and say, okay, as a result of that, now I can seriously focus on how I implement that. It goes well with like Simon Sinek's why, how, what, right? Why is like that whole like really focus on the strategic, but even when you're at the operative level, you're gonna have your why because you've been told to focus on this thing, and then your job though is to really focus on how that's gonna happen so that the what can take place. I think that's really, really cool. So when you were at the Jewish agency, when you were working as an emissary, how did you feel? Like I'm be honest, going to Australia, dream for my wife and me.
Oh, I have to say, yeah, we had a few choices as to where we'd fly. Once Australia and Sydney came on the option, and no offense to anyone else who interviewed us in the process, there's like bucket list, and then if you sort of double click like on old folders on a computer, right, where like you open the folder and you have more folders, then bucket list Australia, and then you see like diving on the Great Barrier Reef, visiting Tasmania, visiting New Zealand, like this whole thing, like okay. Let's go do that.
Let's go do that because we can. Okay. Still going.
No, just because you asked the other side, which is like Australia. So I'll say that there were 2 interesting lessons learned from Australia. One, which is actually, we spoke about a lot about me, and we mentioned Shachal, my wife, at the beginning. She was part of this. We flew together. We were both there. And in that sense, as a young couple flying together for 2 years, very far away from home, there were a lot of lessons we learned about ourselves as individuals, as a couple. And I think that definitely shaped a lot of who we are today, almost 10 years later, raising kids together and everything along those lines. And I think that anyone, it doesn't have to be shlichut to the Jewish agency, if you're relocating to another country, either on your own or with a spouse or a partner or family, you're going to learn a lot about yourself. You go to these places where your natural support nets just are no longer there, right? You have to deal with situations. I'll give, Shach and I might be sort of an extreme in that sense, but we woke up in the morning, we had breakfast, we went to the same offices, we worked together during the day, we went home in the evening, right? So we had to learn how to create space where, it sounds really funny, where we don't see each other during the day, where you give each other your own space to flourish, to be you, not just to see the same person, to have friends who aren't necessarily within the Jewish community, because then we all know everyone. But how can we find places that we have our own quiet, our own space to ourselves, whether it's at a gym, whether it's going to some sort of extracurricular activity, whether it's doing any other hobby you might have. And I'll say that Yuda Seton, today he's the COO of the Jewish agency. He was in charge of the shlichim back then. And I remember his talk with all the married couples going on shlichut, and he said, listen, when you come back from shlichut, it's one of the two. Either you're going to get a divorce, or you're going to be best friends forever. No one has divorced under my watch, and I don't plan for it to be any one of you guys. Right? And he looked at all of us and said that. And he said, and like this idea of finding time to not be with your spouse when you're so far away from home and you don't have your friends and you don't have your usual hangouts and things like that. It was something he pushed very hard, and in retrospect, super, super important. And if you're asking lessons in that sense, then I think really just the personal sort of growth is something very big from any relocation that you can take away. I know it might not be the exact answer you were looking for, but
no, that was great. Are you kidding? That's amazing. Actually, I want to take it for a moment into the idea of COVID. Did that help you sort of deal with COVID in some ways?
I don't know. To be honest, it helps us with a lot of things. It helps us even, whether it's being able to support each other in what we do, because we were the only support we had for each other there, and we understand each other's needs. Even in the workplace, we understand what helps people get through. I understand what helps her get through a hard day. She understands what helps me get through a hard day in a working environment. Understanding when one of us needs more space, all those sort of questions, being able to really communicate, to talk things through. Every couple, every family goes through cycles in life with ups and downs, but when you're living, in that sort of intense environment and you don't have your siblings or your best friends next to you, then that becomes all that more important. So I'm guessing it helped us in COVID too, which is really something that we feel a lot on a day-to-day basis. It takes there. And if I just sort of go to that question you asked about Australia, as Australian doing shlichut there, before I went on shlichut, when Shimon Peres was the president of Israel, he hosted a convention once of Jewish leaders from around the world. And the person who was then representing the Australian Jewish community gave a speech that was titled "The Other 20%," in which he asked everyone to remember that there are 20% of Jews who aren't in Israel or the US. And I think that being there for 2 years and living that gives you a really good understanding that it's very easy when we talk about Jewish peoplehood here in Israel or in the US to sort of get pulled towards those conversations. But there really are a lot of other Jews in other places with thriving communities, with their own history, with really interesting stories and people that happen there. And just being exposed to that, my mother made Aliyah from Canada. My dad made Aliyah from England. I was born in Israel, but seeing another Jewish community, being able to live, to experience, to see their challenges, to see where they thrive and where they succeed that other people might not, and maybe think of ways where larger communities can learn from the smaller communities about certain things and vice versa. It's very, I've spoken before about strategic decisions, sort of soundboarding, getting new ideas and new input. So just being exposed to a new world that I didn't know was very meaningful.
Cool. I want to talk about community for a minute. You've said Jewish community quite a few times, or community in large, without getting into the religion of it, because that's not where I want to go at all. But I recently had a very interesting conversation with someone who works at the Federation of Greater Washington, and she sort of defined Jewish community very differently than a lot of people sort of think about it. And she's taking it from the American perspective. When you talk about Jewish community, and as someone who worked as a Shaliach, you saw the back end, because this woman, Nomi, she works in the back end. She's does business operations for for the Federation, which means she works with people who are not Jewish, but she sees them as part of the Jewish community. I'm curious how it was like in Australia, and how did that formulate your sort of your perspective on Jewish community at large?
So I think when I use the term community, um, it's as broad as you can imagine and then some. I think one of the things that became very apparent to me in Australia, if I compare it to other places, was that communities can be formed around different epicenters. They don't have to be the same one. So if we spoke, you meant just because you mentioned the Federation, so the United States or North America, have a very structured community in that sense, where the federations and it's geographical and JCCs and all sorts of things like that. And if you look at those things, they don't exist in many other places of the world. JCC in London was the first opened about 15 years ago. It's not the idea of a Jewish community center wasn't really apparent. It wasn't part of life there. Whereas if you look at where I was in Australia, and not only in South Africa too, or South America, it's very apparent. Youth movements until today are some of the most strong forces in driving engagement within the Jewish world, where it's not necessarily pastime for grown-ups or JCC extracurricular activities for children, but it's those really sort of traditional youth movements and meeting once a week for an activity where youth lead youth, et cetera, and all those principles that can be very, very central part of it. Another sort of flip side and something that I got to work with a lot in Australia, and I know it's not unique to Australia, that's just where my experience sort of comes from, are old age homes. And in Australia's the Jewish story there is a little interesting, where in the years that are post-Holocaust, post-World War II, the sort of late 40s, the community in Australia doubled itself with refugees who arrived from Europe. And that influx of refugees today, if you feel like when I was there, 8 years ago, but today leads itself to also a large community of elderly Jews, a lot of them Holocaust survivors. And that has its own dynamic of what that means to the community, to the Jewish community around them. Now, all of these things have different epicenters for communities and being built around different, whether it's hobbies or things. Just maybe one last example, the Maccabiah, the third largest sporting event in the world after, FIFA's World Cup and the Olympics.
Olympics.
No, literally by
I
numbers.
I know it's
That's
amazing. It's amazing.
right. So if you look at those at those sort of places, then definitely for Israelis, it's not really on the radar as what it means to be a Jewish community. But if you look at other countries in the world, it's very much prominent in their life. Maccabi youth playing basketball, hockey, field, track, whatever it might be.
Right.
It's part of it, and coming to compete in Israel under that flag of Australia or New Zealand or Argentina, but in Maccabi is part of their Jewish identity. And I think that's something that I really, really took away with me. And I know this wasn't the main part of the question, but also in Australia, and you said like the backstage, there are also non-Jews working sometimes in the organizations, in the community, at schools, at places. That's part of life. So you don't have to necessarily be Jewish to work or be part of that world, but I think it's an interesting dynamic within itself that we don't have time to really dive into now.
Right, that makes sense. So I guess one last sort of deep dive from you, but it's actually going to be something that I'm going to ask you to guide. Was there something that I could have asked that you would have said, "Hey, this is something I really would have loved to talk about," and what is it? And if not, then I have a second question which I can ask.
No, I told you at the beginning, I don't know, I wasn't sure that I'd last an hour of this, so I'm happy
You've
that we got
lasted
to
more
where we
than,
are.
so this is wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, so then I'm gonna ask a more directed question then. We all have the ability to act as shlichim in our world, as agents for change in our world. Whether it's in business, in the your workforce, or in the greater communities that we take part in. What is one thing that you see as something that needs to be focused on, and how are you sort of acting to change that? Where do you see yourself playing a role in that?
That's a deep question.
Yeah, it is. But I still have 10 minutes, so it's
No,
fair.
it's fine. It's all good. I'll take it to a place to where we met. I think
Okay,
there's
great.
different places, but you mentioned the Jewish or the Peoplehood Coalition. I mentioned in passing before, I grew up as a child to Jews who chose to make Israel their home. My mother came from Toronto when she was 19. My dad came from England in his early 20s. It was their choice. And I think, to me, that family background and that family story have always been a very strong part of my identity. And in that sense, you asked. I never answered before, but you asked us like what pushed me to shlichut. I think it was almost natural in that sense for me to go down that path. I can say that when I was in high school, I participated on shorter programs through Tzofim, the Israeli Scouts movement, where I was active and meeting teenagers from around the world, Jewish teenagers from around the world. I spent two months at a young Judea camp in North Carolina as part of the Tzofim delegation there. So there were all sorts of earlier interactions, but to me, being part of that story of Israel as the homeland of the Jewish people, as the nation state of the Jewish people, has always been something very deeply ingrained in my DNA. And I'm guessing that if you look at my sort of life choices, a lot also ties back to there, working in journalism, going on shlichut, working in government. It all, there's all sort of that thing. And now 2 years ago, I made the decision that that's no longer my professional life, but it's still something that I'm active in. And in some extent, it's nice to have it as a hobby, right? Where like I can still be active in the coalition. I can still try to make things happen behind the scenes and help initiatives that I think are important with my knowledge, with my experience, with my networking, etc. And that's something where I think if I had to sort of take all those big words and high level talk and bring it down to day-to-day life, for me, this is my family background. And one of the issues I have is that that's not how everyone feels. And I would be really happy to make people feel like the conversations, we talk about Jewish communities and big communities and small communities in America and Australia and other places. It's not just the title, it's not just the community. They're my cousins. Literally, my cousins who live in Los Angeles, my cousins who live in New Jersey, my cousins who live in Washington, D.C., or in London, or anywhere else in the world.
And it's also your friends who you have in Australia, like those deep relationships you created in Australia. It's
100%. But I'm saying even before that, like 1 degree removed of friends and relationships, I think something that's got a little bit lost over the years as the communities have become more of their own, and also as migration to an extent has lessened over time. There's not as many people changing communities at the same rate as was happening in the world before, the Jewish world, and if it is, it's mainly the US and Israel. And it causes this sort of conversation to be a very theoretical one at times of, the Jewish world, the Jewish issues, the questions we have about Israel's relationship with the Jewish world. And it's important when you come back to public policy and, in previous roles, and yes, you have to ask them at that level. But for a second, like the driving force behind my dealing with those worlds and my wanting to be part of them isn't just a theoretical question. It's much more, basic than that. It's how do I want my cousin to feel when she comes visit Israel? How do I want her to feel when she meets my friend who's coming to visit Los Angeles? Like that's, and I think that if we could all take those conversations and maybe by extent other theoretical conversations we have about social issues, each person where they feel attached to, not everyone has to feel that the Jewish world is their biggest dealing just because that's where I feel strongly engaged. And we, remember that, yes, there's theories and there are large picture questions that need to be asked and need to be answered, but also there are people with faces and feelings behind those large conversations, and how does it relate to them at an individual level? And I think we can make the world a little bit of a better place.
That's phenomenal. Aaron, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. I learned a ton. And it was fun to hear how you implement a lot of the stuff that I teach or that I help people understand, how you are implementing it in your life and in Lightricks, and also how you sort of have learned it on your own without having somebody say, hey, listen, this is what you're talking about. Let me give you some basics on it. You're like, I've learned it already.
I want to thank you for asking me to join the conversation, for forcing me also to try and articulate some of the thoughts in my head over the years, or the processes that I've gone through. But I also want to reserve the right to completely contradict everything I've said the next time we speak, because I don't know what I'm going to be thinking about, in 3 weeks or 6 months.
100%, because you may learn something and go, wait a second, everything I said about that topic, I just learned how wrong it was.
So if we said, decisions are right for the information you have at a given point in time, this was today, tomorrow is tomorrow.
Fair enough. I can accept that 100%. Either which way, I greatly appreciate what we spoke about. I found it to be a very good conversation, and I really do think that there's a lot that people can learn about strategy and about really thinking in depth about where they are in a process, or what their influence can be in those processes, whether it's in business or in government, or like you said, in the Jewish world, where they can say, hey, you can think big picture, but there's also that interpersonal space where we have to remember these are human beings. And that's true in business as well. Like, you can think, layoffs, but you also have to think like, but these are also human beings. Like, you need to be able to see those two. Doesn't mean you don't make the decision, but it means you want to be absolutely certain that that decision you're making has as much information that's been analyzed as well as humanly possible, so that when you make that decision and it impacts the human beings, it's done well.
100%.
And I think that those were great lessons. So thank you so much for this. This has been phenomenal.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us in the Doctor's Den. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Hope to see you next time.